Grassroots economic organizing, catalyzing worker cooperatives and the solidarity economy for over 30 years. Visit us online at geo.coop.
Community economic development strategies, particularly what we're calling cooperative solidarity economy strategies. I also have specialized in wealth inequality and African American history in general, I guess. And I'm really interested in trying to figure out how we can move the cooperative solidarity economy forward, especially in Black communities and communities of color.
Okay. And to say a little bit more about myself, I spent 35 years as a co-founder and co-developer and co-manager of an intentional community in Staten Island, New York called GANAS. And we had a very specific objective that we've explored in multiple ways, and that is creating a culture of cooperation and mutuality through personal change. And that's kind of the perspective that I've approached all of the movement work that I've done. So I kind of came up with the idea for this discussion because of having read a couple of interviews that Jessica did with regards to her book Collective Courage. And there's one passage out of one of those interviews that was done by Next System that really captures the whole issue of the Crossroads as she was seeing it, and I immediately identified, yes, I totally agree with that, although we probably have very differing, things to say about it. So either I could read it, Jessica, or you could read it.
I'll read it. Though I thought we had agreed to use the quote from the interview that Adjoa did with me on Geo. No?
They're both there if you want to, whichever one you want to use. It's just that the Crossroads comes into focus with...
W.B. Du Bois actually had said in 1907 that we were at a crossroads, and I was taking up his a quote, which I can never remember the exact quote, and his imagery about that we were at a crossroads in 1907, and I'm saying that in 2015-16 we're also at a crossroads. It looks like we're going again towards the individualist route, the capitalist route. The crossroads was a fork between going the capitalist way and everybody trying to pursue their own attempts at getting wealth, and then the other way was supposed to be the cooperative, collective, group way where there was broad ownership. People were working together so that everybody had prosperity. And it seems like every time we have a choice, we've been either pushed into or we've chosen the individualistic route, probably because we live in a capitalist society. But I guess I was supposed to read, not talk. So we're at a crossroads now, but it looks like we're going towards that individualistic capitalist route, which is basically what we did. We should have taken the other route, and I think that we're in the same crossroads again. We've been at the crossroads many times. We keep taking the wrong route, but we have a chance to take the better route, to correct our route, and we actually know how to do it. One of my pet peeves is that we keep thinking we don't know what to do, but we know because we have lots of models that have succeeded over the centuries. What we don't have is enough will and enough education about how to do it.
Okay. You want to start? What do you mean by when you say not enough education? What do you have in mind?
Right. Well, we are in a society where the hegemonic ideology and language is all about individual ownership, individual pursuit of happiness, and capitalism. And so even when people either can't succeed at, when people can't succeed at it, we assume it's their fault, not the system's fault, because the language is about how everybody can succeed. You just have to try hard enough. And when people do succeed at it, the language is also that they did it as an individual. When if you look at anybody who's really wealthy, they had lots of help between their wife or their family members, the employees that took below living wages, between all the government subsidies, whether it's the internet or roads or whatever. So nobody really does it alone, and yet the notion is that we've done it alone. And we don't have a language, and we don't teach children early on about the powers of collective action and cooperative ownership. And people don't really know about the projects that are cooperative and solidarity that work unless they have a language for it so they can see what's happening in their community, because a lot of this stuff is happening informally, but because we don't have a language for it and we don't value it in the capitalist economy, people don't recognize it, right? So that's what I mean by that's the first basis part of education, is we need knowledge and exposure to different ways of thinking about the economy, different ways of thinking about how we relate to each other financially, and exposure to the things that work that aren't capitalistic and exploitative.
I thought it was really interesting along these lines, the way that cooperation becomes invisible with the siege in Oregon, where the militias took over the building within a preserve, a federal preserve, in protest of the way that the federal government was managing common lands and the prosecution of a rancher who used fire on federal lands illegally. And these demonstrators, these militia members, are part of a movement that thinks that there's no structure of government that's legitimate above the county level of sheriff, and that the sheriff is the highest level. And they reach into history to try to justify their ideology, and it's totally false. I mean, the sheriff was never the structure. But they also tried to say that they were acting in the name of the Native Americans, that there had been abuse of Native American artifacts on this preserve. And the Paiutes, who live in that area and are in some ways dominant in that area, rejected that and said these federal lands actually are the closest. They're not our lands, but they're common lands.
Closest to common lands.
And
that we have,
and
right.
so you had these hyper individualistic people who were trying to call for the dissolving federal lands into individual ownership, and kind of distorting history to do so, and then you had people who were standing up and said, "Don't use our name in our name, because that's just false." But the invisibility of the collective ownership of common lands and what that means and how they're managed, that you don't think about it. I did articles. I did actually a radio documentary on taxes, and a group in Alabama would do trainings, and they would ask, "What do you get out of your tax dollars?" And nobody thought about roads and common infrastructure that everybody uses. It's just not. People don't see common government action even when it's happening. So more kind of interesting cooperative action through co-ops is totally invisible.
Yep.
You know, credit unions, people are members of credit unions, they don't even know what they are.
Right.
You know, the credit unions themselves, even the cooperatives themselves,
Sometimes
are frequently neglecting the kind of education that's needed so you can get to scale and then lose the advantage of the solidarity that can be created through your institution. Right. So I'm not saying that always happens, but it can definitely happen.
There's also a really great paradox in this, in the sense that the invisibility of cooperative enterprises, at the same time that there's something like 111 million people in the United States that are members of some kind of cooperative. Mm-hmm. I was a member of a credit union in Texas when I was working in the school district, and I had no idea that I was a member of anything. It was just a great bank. There's better banking that I could do there than I could with the regular bank, and no one ever sat down and said, look, here's the story about being, part of a credit union. So it's even invisible to the people who are running them,
Right.
that
Yeah.
there is this whole tradition and history and philosophy that's involved in it. And it's to come to the education question. What I learned through our experiments and explorations with personal change and cooperative development is that this whole business of the individualism and the capitalism, etc., is that all of that culture is in me and in you. I mean, we are the culture as well as the culture being out there. And I think that one of the real major stumbling blocks in terms of the Crossroads is that we don't recognize that we embody all of the contradictions
Right.
to what we're trying to do. And so we don't catch our racism, we don't catch our sexism, we don't catch our, top-down decision-making. And you see it happening throughout all of the movements, and people don't really know how to quite get a hold of it.
Right.
And to me, that is, at some point, to really become a vital thing to grab a hold of. How can we become aware of how we are, what we're trying to change, so that then if we can change it in ourselves,
Right.
we can actually start to have a lot more impact outside. But that, I don't expect very many people to agree with me on that.
Well, I mean, I agree. I think that's one of the stumbling blocks, too. I was thinking when you said it, not actually of co-op solidarity examples, but even like parenting, and I was also a teacher for a while, and you find yourself doing exactly the stuff that you didn't want to, the kind of parent you didn't want to be, or saying the things that you didn't, you never wanted to say as a parent, or even as a teacher, like, shut up and sit down. Not that you said shut up, but sometimes you got close to saying that, right? And yet you vowed when you were gonna, you would never tell a child that because you believe children learn by moving around and exploring and this and that, right? And then you get in the classroom and, so it's really hard. And so I think you're right. It's probably harder for us to see it in ourselves, but it's also part of that stumbling block because it is so ingrained. And so trying to figure out when and how do we get the opportunities to practice it in a way that it becomes more and more normal, right, is then another one of those problems. I gave a speech actually a long time ago when I was first getting into this about how, and I don't know, it might be an arduous interview with me too, but how really we put our humanity and our morals, we leave them at the door when we enter the economic sphere, especially our job. Because on the job it's supposed to be, we're supposed to, it's the competition and we're supposed to be better than everybody else and beat the so we spend, 8 to 10 hours a day, most of our waking hours, in positions where we're actually dehumanizing ourselves and dehumanizing other people, and then we go home and we're supposed to be human again, right?
Yeah. It's a little difficult.
Yeah. So even if we have the right ideology, trying to figure out how and when we can practice it and when it's safe to practice it is the next problem, right? So it's also hard, even if we do say we can introduce people, make the invisible visible, do better education and stuff. It's still hard until we can have places where we can practice it. It's hard to figure out how people can really make those real choices to be on the right path, if we're back to the Crossroads metaphor.
Well, I've been hopeful that we're moving through this crossroads. I think we are at a crossroads. Someone just asked me the other day whether they thought that whether the solidarity economy movement is in eclipse, that they feel a certain slowdown, I guess, which is where the crossroads question comes in. Are we at a slowdown? Have we lost enthusiasm or direction? Have we gone as far as we can go based on bootstrapping our small organizations? And I am hopeful by the cities, certain cities stepping up, and activists in cities. Rebecca Kemble on the City Council of Madison, Wisconsin, and she's the president of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, and helping strategize how the city itself can support more worker ownership, for instance. And so I think people have been reticent to step into positions of power and to really pursue more traditional power because of the challenge to our we don't want to exercise that power over people. We see it as a more coercive power, and so I think we avoid it. But there's no way that we can sidestep that form of power if we're going to nurture our institutions. Our institutions depend on that. They depend on the political sphere. So for moving through the crossroads, spending more time at the municipal level, or thinking about the interface between our institutions and municipal government or state government, places that we feel more, where we can have more of an influence, and that has to reverberate back on our movements and our organizing. It'll make us rethink from the way that we've been doing things. So I think that's part of the slow work of building the institutions where we can practice our solidarity. That's politics is another place where you can learn civil solidarity as opposed to what Donald Trump is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So take up that space.
So, yeah, I think the whole issue of, like what's happened at the New York City Council and government, supporting it, and the one in Madison, and and other places where it's happening, is all very, very important. But at the same time, I have a lot of anxiety about it. Even we've got City Foundation, CITI Foundation, which is giving a lot of money to the cooperative movement
right,
now.
That's Citibank, isn't it?
That's
Yeah.
Citibank, right.
Mm-hmm.
So, for me, the question comes up is that to the extent that we are unaware that we embody all of the problems we're trying to solve, to the extent that we're just not aware of that, I see as the risk of us misusing all of those opportunities and getting caught up, and then we're just practicing what we're trying to change because we just don't see that we're, like the example you used as a parent. All of a sudden I see myself doing all of the things I said I would never do, and then there's all of the parenting you did that you didn't see was the same as, and so I don't know how we can get a hold of that until we really start saying we've got to find ways in which we're looking at our own motivation and talking about that.
Well, I don't think you can hold back from certain forms of practice until our consciousness and subjectivity is in the right place, because you make the road by walking, right? I mean, you have to do it when you're in motion, and that's what's so hard. You can't wait. You have to be in motion. And I think a big issue for me is, we can deal with the internal stuff. We have to learn to hear each other and to take challenge. For me, it's the challenge that I worry about is the need to go beyond our own sector, and that the internal work that we're doing in our own sector, and what happens when we really think about engaging beyond our existing networks.
You're talking getting into like the city council.
It could be the municipal government, or it could be unions working with unions. When we get out of our comfort zone, our organizing comfort zone, and we're working in locations, and then you're going to face something that I have been working on along with economic justice stuff, which is right-wing populism, which is Donald Trump, where you have people who the economy has gone to hell. People are holding on with their fingertips. They feel like the things are not working for them, and they scapegoat immigrants. That the solution is to bash people who have even less power than they do. So it's sort of a kind of distortion of class power, and you have to. I think that's something that you've written about, the way that cooperatives are something that excite people across political lines, right? And so you're going to end up working with people as we expand and go beyond our comfort zone, who are going to be bringing in these notions of right-wing populism. So we're not just talking about struggling with the people that we've been comfortable with struggling with around these things. If we're really serious about growing, then those are folks who we're going to be engaging with more.
So Abby, are you talking about like we're mostly out in the margins? You're talking about us getting much more involved with mainstream politics?
I don't consider them part of mainstream politics. I'm talking about, if you're expanding cooperatives in municipalities or rural areas, that you're going to encounter this. People are now trying to redemocratize electrical co-ops, right, for instance, right? There's a whole movement around that, and especially because of climate change, and they want to use the democratic mechanisms in order to shift rural electrical co-ops to green energy. Well, who are you engaging with? Who are you going to meet in those struggles?
Right.
And that and the crossroads that Jessica and W.E.B. Du Bois have marked have often been, we've taken the wrong road because of race and racism, where the New Deal had these cooperative ventures built into it, and they also had racist, white supremacist economic development built into it. Both, the only way they could get one was to do the other. They were connected, and so that's what I'm kind of thinking. I'm curious. It's a question. I'm curious about it. But you're right. I think we have to prepare ourselves for at this crossroads to not tolerate things that we can't tolerate in our movement because we're struggling in these other arenas.
Right.
Jessica?
Yeah, you guys are getting me thinking. Well, the first thing is I totally agree about making the road as we walk it. So I have been feeling very strongly, I guess the last 10 or 15 years I've been doing this work, that we have to start practicing it, even if we're not ready to practice it, and even if we don't know exactly, we don't have all the answers, because it's in the practicing that we'll get more ready, that we'll learn things, that we'll develop, and that we can change ourselves internally as well as externally. That if we don't try to keep practicing it, it's even worse, right? And I guess it's a hope. It's part of my philosophy that the more of us that practice it, the more we all start to transform ourselves and the society. So we just have to start doing it. I think my example would be some of the worker co-ops that as they're practicing it, they actually start to develop strategies that both transform their organizations and transform themselves. So the ways that some of the really strong worker co-ops have been able to really develop good, strong meeting facilitation and conflict resolution strategies, that they realize that their co-op won't be strong if they don't start to put these practices into place. And then when they put these practices into place, they're able to grow. They also are able to be experts for other people. So that's one of the kinds of ways I see the practice. The other thing for me is the practice, and I started to look into this once when I was at Democracy Collaborative, looking at people who are in democratic economic relations. Do they then start to operate that way in their civic lives? And there wasn't huge evidence, but there was some evidence that yes, if you're in a housing co-op or a worker co-op, you get used to that level of democratic participation and transparency, and you start to expect it in other places, on your school board or in your school PTA, or even sometimes in your other work relations or whatever. And so I think, again, to me, even taking over so the municipalities, part of it is if we get more and more people practicing cooperative economics, we have more and more people who are developing leadership, who are willing to say, okay, well, now I know we need this policy. Let's go and take it to the city council. Let's take it to the state, whatever. And so you get people who can be more active civically. So I kind of have this notion that starts with, I mean, obviously you have to have some of the education to know that you want to practice it, but it starts with practicing it in whatever ways you can, and then trying to create more and more opportunities to practice it, and in the practice then changing both the systems and yourself. And I think the other place where that's important is in the racism stuff, because one of the reasons I think that the solidarity economy and the co-op movement haven't gotten very far is because they end up self-sabotaging, because they're still operating in these racist, patriarchal systems. And so often there's too many examples of the co-op movement just being a co-op for white folks and not addressing the racial issues, or just having the men always be the directors and the leaders, and the women just always doing the scut work, right? So there's, people keep saying to me, you sound like or I say I sound like a Pollyanna, because they keep saying to me, I sound so optimistic that all you need is a co-op and you solve everything, and you don't. But again, once you start to practice, then it's easier to see your own contradictions and try to deal with the other things. Of course, some people just get stuck. But I think it is easier. We are seeing it now. The solidarity economy movement is trying to address colonialism and racism and colonial legacies of colonial attitudes. Some of the co-op movement is now, I honestly think that's one of the reasons my book has gotten so much interest, because there's a lot of traditional co-op people who are saying we have to be able to reach other people, and so we have to, be able to talk to them. And so this way, at least knowing that they're, resurrecting this history for African Americans is a way to have the conversations with African Americans and other groups that actually this is part of your heritage too. It's not just that the Norwegians that came to the U.S. did this, right? So somehow we've got to figure out how to help people to do something more, to get in it and then to do more with it when they're in it, and not be complacent about it. And I think partly the motto helps that, but obviously there's got to be more involved with it, because we're not going to get past the crossroads if we don't address some of these issues.
Well, that's a contradiction in where the cooperative movement is, because in these smaller scale co-ops they look for people who are compatible,
right?
Because they're very vulnerable enterprises, and if you have bring someone in who you don't feel is on your wavelength, then that's going to make it harder in your everyday practice.
Yeah.
And yet that's
Right.
that's
the
part of the
movement.
work.
Right. The
So-
work depends on it, right?
Yeah.
So I turn that off. So
Yeah, the compatibility is an issue. I want to go back to the idea of walking the walk. Okay,
or
because
making the road, yeah.
Abby, the way you set it up was that walking the walk is doing the external work, and to me,
And the internal work at the same time.
okay, then that's the point I want to make. They are not separate.
Right.
Okay, they're never separate. I mean, we're sitting here and talking, and we are coming out of the externals and the internals of our life experience constantly. And the thing, what we practice a lot, and then later on at Ghana's in my community, and then I realized later that this was basically the brilliance behind Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, is that you act, you go out and you do the things, but then you have to reflect,
Come back.
because you're reflecting on how you're doing them and what you're doing them as well. And the thing that I don't see, it's Jessica's phone ringing and she's fumbling with it and trying to get it to behave. Anyway, and I don't see, to me, there's a huge imbalance. There's a lot of, if you go to a conference, for example, you will get maybe 90 to 100% of the workshops are all about the external dynamics, issues, projects. You get hardly anyone talking about how do we reflect on this? How do we work with the racism? Here's the racism we're running into. How do we work with that? How do we work with the fact that so many decision-making structures are being set up, out like in some of the areas where it's the developers that are running the movement and not the worker owners, et cetera, et cetera. So, to me, the imbalance is just huge, and I don't see anyone, at least too many people. I'm kind of looking around all the time, but I just don't see the energy and the interest, the awareness, the sensitivity to to that need of the internal work.
Yeah, it's a society we live in, right? We're in a society where that's not rewarded either, right? You're not supposed to be too introspective. You're not supposed to stop and reflect. In fact, right, for capitalism, it's a waste of time, right? You should be back on the assembly line, not not reflecting.
Ironically, outside of our movements, in many areas, there's a lot of personal work that is being done, a lot of personal reflection. But it's completely isolated from any sense of any kind of political involvement. It's got no social dimension. It's all about me, how my yoga, my meditation, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So you've got the same dynamic in reverse out there, and that we have than what we have in here, or something, roughly speaking.
Yeah, I was. When Abby was, to finish that, I think figuring out how to reflect together, right, is probably what would connect our movement more and give us that space to work on it. And again, I think some groups do it better than others. The other thing I was thinking about when Abby was talking about, the contradictions, even in our own co-ops and things, that's why I also have been trying to use the solidarity economy terminology and practice, because that also helps us if we locate our co-op work within a solidarity framework, that helps us not to fall into the trap of reproducing some of the same hierarchies and things. But it's also hard to pull them together, because one, the language just gets, you end up having to say 5 adjectives in one phrase or whatever. right? And in addition to it just not melding so much. But I think that's what saves the co-op movement, right? Because I now start to talk about not all co-ops are the kind of co-ops that I'm excited about or really trying to study or do, right? Some co-ops are out of it. The co-ops that are in the solidarity economy, that are part of this solidarity movement, are the ones I'm interested in. And why do I have to make that distinction? Exactly for what we've been talking about, because even though I believe that the co-op model was supposed to kind of address a lot of those hierarchies and things, it's been hijacked also. And so there's lots of co-ops that ignore all the real principles of being a co-op, right? And a co-op in name, they get away with doing the minimum of a co-op, right? But not the maximum. But we're all talking about the maximum, right? Practicing every single principle, connecting it with this notion of solidarity, right? So somehow we also have to have a higher standard, I guess, is what I'm thinking. Especially in this society, but I think it happens in a lot of other societies too. The co-ops can be co-opted, and they also can do the minimal, and people think it's enough when it's really not.
I also think that, and this is something I encountered in my own organizing, where I was working with an association that was forming cooperatives for progressive magazines, because we realized we had to change the media landscape for us to survive. Small independent bookstores were disappearing. Those were where our newsstands were. This was even before the rise of the internet. We needed to create our own newsstands. We needed to work together. We opened up beyond the progressive magazines to include other magazines, because that scale, and also it creates a better ecosystem for everybody, right? Because you strengthen the whole independent sector. And then we looked around, and it was predominantly white publications. And so the magazines were white dominated. They weren't entirely. One of the leaders in this also was Third Force magazine, which was out of the Center for Third World Organizing. And so then they said, okay, well, we're going to bring this cooperative model to publications of color. And then they realized, oh, these are mostly newspapers, right? These are not magazines. And so our business structure and strategy was all shaped around magazines. So we had to go where the publications were, which was newspaper. Black newspaper, Haitian newspaper, and what those folks needed was going to be different. And to change the economic landscape that they were working in, we had to do different things, and we had to figure that out. And so there's also, and I think this is a story for a lot of these journeys, that, you know, if once you're serious and you're really thinking about this, you're going to end up in a place that is going to be different than
where you started, or
where
where
you
you thought, or
yeah,
where you thought
and what you thought,
go, and you have to be willing.
Yeah.
We're letting go of preconceptions
Right.
and all of that.
Yeah. So, and I don't know what that means exactly here, but I know it's going to happen. You know, and I know in just in my reporting and talking to people, and they talk about the challenge of sustaining entrepreneurship. They really want to change, use worker co-op model in low-income communities, and yet there's also certain parts of the business aspect that in the growth of these co-ops, these co-op incubators are holding on to and providing business services for much longer than what we would expect. And, you know, they're not...
You mean it's to their financial interest to do that? Or?
No. I mean, you could say it's in the interest of whatever nonprofit is doing the incubation for them to hold on to it so that they get grant money. I mean, or money from the co-op. But you know what? Maybe, and our knee-jerk reaction is to say, oh, well, this has to revolve back into the co-op eventually, so it's truly controlled within, or you have this clientelistic relationship between this nonprofit and the worker co-op. But you know what? Maybe we have to really think about this and say, how do we maybe this is an okay structure, and how do we make it not clientelistic? So
to make the structure work, because we might need it, but take away the clientelistic part of it, or the hierarchical part.
So
of
this
it.
is like, we really going to have to stretch revise the categories we tend to think in and coming out and say, no, that's not really the proper way to do a worker co-op. And it's like, well, look at the whole context where this is happening. You know, I like the immigrant co-ops and how they're incubated, and that's one of the fastest growing areas for worker co-ops. And it's a very crossover area as well. I think that's what I'm picking up. And Abby's nodding her head.
Yes, yes.
We keep forgetting
Yes.
Right, I know that it's
that
not
we're
video.
not on television here.
Right. You know, and I'm also thinking about the example of the food co-ops in low-income black neighborhoods, right? And so many times the model for food co-op development is just so antithetical, it turns people off, right? If you read the manuals and stuff, they talk about you have to have the right middle-class white demographic because they have to be your base because they're the only ones who are going to buy healthy food. You know, it starts to get even stereotypical that they don't, you know, nobody else knows how to prepare fresh vegetables, you know, and and so if you're, you know, in Dorchester or some other, you know, predominantly black inner city, and you read these manuals, you're like, oh, I guess that's not for us, right?
Right.
So again, trying to figure out how do you break through that, you know? And they think they've got the model down, right? They explained how you can,
Yes.
you know, get profit in 3 years and what makes sense and how you can attract the right funding and all that. But then they forgot totally all about all these other social, cultural.
Right. It's like that is institutional racism.
Right.
And they would never know.
Right.
Who
No.
was.
But
No
right,
way.
because we live in co-ops, right? We're little hippie radicals. We're not
Right.
institutional racists, and yet they're practicing it,
Right.
right? So then, how do you get beyond that, and how do you get people to feel like it's a friendly model and an adaptable model? You know, and again, back to I've been talking to them about just changing some of their. Well, they have to change some of the stuff that they wrote about what you need, but they also need to change some of the materials, right? They need to give some examples of Black and Latino groceries co-ops and
Or it might
how
be a
they
buyers
did.
club.
Or
right?
Yes,
I mean,
right.
maybe
And a lot of them start with buyers
economically,
club. Right.
Economically,
It's just a
with-
buyers club,
when,
right.
especially in some areas where you have Walmart.
Right. Right.
So
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So there's different types. You have different options and types. Right. You
right,
put
that
those
the
on
vision that
table.
you have
Right.
may not be
Right.
what.
Right.
At all relevant.
Or farmers markets, right?
Right.
You know, and then connecting farmers markets with a buying club or whatever. So there's lots of different ways, right? But they don't, right? They need to expand how they see it and what they do, and obviously they need help. It sounds like there's some of these groups are starting to realize they need help, so that's the good sign. But sometimes there's been a lot of damage done already,
Right.
and so
This
trying
is
to
one of the
figure
reasons
out
why
how to mitigate that.
If I had my way, all of the conferences we go to would all be set up in ways in which people can dialogue. So food co-ops, what's the future of food co-ops? You got people, you know, black, brown, green, yellow, talk, no, you just got to fix, you know, and they talk and they hear each other, you know, and that, you know, of course, that's my whole thing. Anyway, there was an article that I read recently, which I hope we post on Geo, which really, there was one little part of it that just like really hit me. In Philadelphia, there is a agricultural project, an urban agricultural project, and they're growing all of the kinds of foods that are traditional to African Americans, et cetera, and they bring in kids, you know, to work the garden, et cetera, and then somehow it was. The suggestion was it wasn't a planned thing, it was just kind of thing that emerged, that while they're working, they get into these chants that the African American slaves were using in the fields, you know, and that there's just, you know, redirecting the whole, you know, that tradition, you know, and then they had a time in which they brought white kids in, you know, to join them and be part of it, and there was no singing.
It was quiet.
There was no singing. It is like we're not in our element, you know. And so that's another, you know, dynamic.
Right, and we're not good about when is segregation okay and when isn't it, right? Or when is something separate or slightly different? When is it okay and when it's not? That's another thing we don't know how to handle. And yet, you know, that e pluribus unum was supposed to mean that you still had some individuality for groups, but we still work together, right? But we're not good about how you do that.
So we've just covered a wide berth of stuff, and the wrap-up is going to be in the form of each one of us kind of addressing how all of this stuff that we were covering relates to the issue of the crossroads. And after we finish that, we're going to make an invitation for y'all to respond and invite and, you know, ask for more, whatever. So
On GEO's website.
On GEO's website, Grassroots Economic Organizing, geo.coop. But of course, you'll be listening to this from if you're on GEO.
If you're on GEO
anyway.
already, right?
Anyway, so. Which one of you ladies wants to go first doing a wrap-up? That was a very interesting way for me to get out of it.
Well, I think Jessica should have the last word, so I'll throw in my hat. And I feel like we're at a crossroads where I felt like the United States was a center-right country for a long time. And I feel like the center is looking left now. I don't know why I feel that way. I don't know if it's this election season, which you can't tell anything from two little states. I don't think it's that. But I think that does give us an opportunity, and where this question we started with about the way that cooperation is invisible means that as a strategy we have to think about how to make cooperation visible. So as sort of marching orders, that part of our work, which GEO does, maybe all of us thinking more about how we do that. So that's my last word.
Okay. So first thing I'll do with that is I'll springboard a plug for a book I co-wrote, Building Cooperative Power, which deals with the whole issue of visibility in the whole second half of the book, and the strategic approach that the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops is taking towards regional economic development is focusing on creating the visibility in that region. So it's like everything turns on the visibility. So in that term, but in terms of my own personal kind of summary statement is kind of what I've already said. There is so much that is happening. There's so much that is possible. And all that means is that all of the embedded mutuality that we have from our culture, we wouldn't have a culture unless there was a very powerful mutuality factor operating across the whole spectrum. It tends to be invisible. It's like, we see Trumps and all of that stuff. We don't see that, but it's there. It's like I get off the ferry and you walk off the ferry and there's 200 or 300 people walking, and they're walking through 8 swinging doors, and it's like 80% of the people are making sure they turn back to make sure the person behind them, the door, it's there. We wouldn't have a society if it wasn't. But that's what we draw on. That's the power that we draw on. We just need to empower that mutuality a lot more in order to really, come to this crossroads and move in a lot more dynamic way than we have in the past. And I think one of the key issues that we mentioned, but we didn't really get into it, Jessica's phone is saying, you're right, this is perfect timing, and that is, we really don't know, our thinking about power is all messed up. We keep defining it in terms of what gets imposed, and power is just the ability to move in a direction you want to move in.
Right.
And if we really want to move down the cooperative crossroads, we have to do it with power. And there's many forms of power, but we have to embrace power. And that also means we have to really look at how we embody all of the stuff we're trying to change. And the key thing is we have to think becoming the change we want to bring to the world. Jessica?
Yeah, well, gave me the last word, but I like what you've both said. So I too agree. I think we're poised to take the correct road, and of course by the correct road I mean the cooperative solidarity economy. And I think we're poised for a couple of reasons. One is because we are starting to talk about it and make visible the alternatives. I think partly because in some ways capitalism is dying yet again. That it gave us some space for people to say, well, maybe there's something else, maybe there's something better. The problem is that capitalism always, it's, what is it, the phoenix or the cat or whatever, it always comes back. So we need to figure out whether we can get ourselves on this new road before capitalism gets its next gasp, or whether we can get on that road to help transform capitalism or destroy it or whatever, if we want to go that far. So I think I agree we need the visibility, but we also need to take that power and not be afraid of power. And I would finally say the other reason that I think we're poised in the right place but not quite there is because of, we talked a little bit about the isms, racism, sexism, classism. To really move onto that road in a meaningful way in a multiracial society that we really have to understand those intersectionalities and be willing to really do something about the structural inequalities that we have, because otherwise we'll start to walk on that road, but that road will look a lot like it'll turn into the other road, right? So the only way to make that road to be the real cooperative solidarity road that we want it to be is we have to also use our power to address the oppressions and make sure that they don't rise up in the new system.
Great.
Okay. So, folks, if you really enjoyed this and found it useful, and if you think there's stuff we missed, and which we undoubtedly did, or criticisms to make or additions to make, whatever, we really, really invite you to respond. There's a comment. There'll be a comment section at the bottom of the GEO page. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
This has been a production of GEO, Grassroots Economic Organizing. Find us on the web at geo.coop.